History is not a straight line. It is a labyrinth of unanswered questions, corridors turning back on themselves, chambers that open into new mysteries. Monuments stand aligned with stars we no longer see. Ancient texts whisper of devices that should not exist. Legends speak of gods who may have been more than myth. For centuries, we have accepted the official story. But what if the truth is stranger, far stranger, and more profound than we were taught? Tonight, we peel back the layers of time and step into the world's most baffling ancient enigmas. Listen closely, because the trail begins in the sand. Beneath the shifting dunes of Central Asia, a city once pulsed like a living heart on the Silk Road, a metropolis that dazzled its rivals and drew scholars the way stars draw sailors. From there, the path threads east, where cliffs of soft stone bloom with 1,000 Buddhas whose colors refuse to fade. Farther on, a mountain rises like a haystack into the clouds, its sheer face stitched with wooden walkways and hollowed chambers that have survived storms and earthquakes for a millennium and a half. Across the steppe, an empire's tombs sleep under turf and stone, horses buried by the dozen, weapons ready for an afterlife campaign, and treasures that rewrite the boundaries of nomad. In the foothills, a single burial opens to a figure gleaming with more than 4,000 pieces of gold craft, so delicate it challenges our sense of what was possible 2,000 years ago. And in river-cut gorges, entire philosophies fuse in sandstone, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, chiseled into a living library whose faces still seem to follow you as you pass. Finally, a monastery city in the Tarim Basin crumbles to dust, its rise as vivid as a sunrise, its disappearance as abrupt as night. We will follow each thread and ask what really happened. Was greatness undone by war, by water, by the slow drift of trade? Or were these places built on foundations more fragile and more extraordinary than we realize? You will hear how a fortress in the desert made engineers ask what threat demanded such walls. How a hidden chamber of manuscripts transformed our view of the Silk Road, how clay became immortal, how barbarian turned out to be a mask ripped away by archaeology, how granules of gold were fixed with microscopic precision, and how stone sermons taught morality to the masses with a vividness that parchment never could. But we are not here to preach certainties. We are here to weigh the evidence, to look at what the ruins tell us, and what they refuse to say. We will keep one foot squarely in the historical record and let the other step into the liminal space where science, craft, faith, and human ambition meet. Because the past is not a museum display. It is a conversation across time. Some answers are buried in riverbeds that shifted, in trade winds that turned. Others hide in techniques that seem to vanish, just as we learn to name them. And a few, just a few, may linger in that gap between what we can measure and what our ancestors believed. So let us make this a true expedition. As we journey through Merv's vanished avenues, the Mogao Grotto's painted light, Maijishan's sky paths, the Xiongnu's royal dead, Issyk's golden icon, Dazu's stone scriptures, and Subashi's fallen halls, bring your questions. Argue with us. Tell us where the evidence points you. Does the official story fit? Or does it leave geometry that won't quite close? Here's our opening challenge to you, the first fork in the labyrinth. Why do you think the world's greatest city could disappear almost overnight, leaving behind only wind-scoured walls and a silence that still unnerves archaeologists? Was it conquest? Was it climate? Or is there a deeper pattern in the rise and fall of cities built on routes that could vanish with a single political turn, or a river that wandered away? Drop your thoughts below. We will read them as we go. Because some mysteries do not yield to a single voice. They open only when many minds push at the same door. The sands are shifting. The doors are opening. And the old stories are ready to be tested. Next, we walk into the ghost of a metropolis that once outshone Baghdad and Constantinople. Merv, the jewel of the Silk Road where libraries rose like palaces and astronomers mapped the heavens while merchants mapped the world. Why did such a place fall silent? The answers begin now. Hidden beneath the shifting sands of the Karakum Desert lies the ghost of a city that was once the beating heart of the Silk Road. This was not just any settlement. It was MV, a dazzling metropolis that, for a moment in history, outshone Baghdad and Constantinople. Here, caravans from China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean converged in a blaze of languages, faiths, and ideas. Silk and spices changed hands. Gemstones flashed in market light, and with every deal struck, a second exchange unfolded. Knowledge for knowledge, story for story, calculation for calculation. In MV, the ledger and the library grew side by side. As early as the 3rd millennium BCE, the land of MV shows traces of human settlement. From that deep prelude onward, the city rose to prominence under the Achaemenids, then the Susids, the Parthianists, the Sassanids, and later the Abbasids and Seljuks. Each dynasty left a layer, and each layer tightened MV's grip on the routes between east and west. MV was not an ordinary city. It was a strategic gateway. Whoever held it could slow, speed, or silence the traffic of a continent. That power turned MV into a beacon amid the desert, an oasis where cultures converged, collided, and radiated outward again, shaping the face of Central Asia for centuries. By the 12th century, under the Seljuk dynasty, MV reached its apogee. Medieval records describe it as perhaps the most populous city in the world, surpassing even Baghdad and Constantinople in scale. Its vast libraries and renowned schools drew scholars like lodestones draw needles. Astronomers tracked the turning heavens. Physicians debated treatments and humors. Mathematicians refined methods. Theologians wrestled with law and logic. In the chronicles of the time, MV earned a reputation as the capital of science and intellect in Central Asia, a place where the mind was both refuge and engine. Architecture made that reputation visible. Massive, multi-layered walls ringed the city, their lines still traceable in the ruins. Seljuk palaces rose with airy courtyards and precise inscriptions, while mosques and mausoleums anchored neighborhoods with rhythm and ritual. Watchtowers surveyed the horizon, their silhouettes a promise of order in a harsh land. The most prominent was Gorala, an immense fortress whose construction techniques advanced for their day still prompt archaeologists to ask, what threats did the people of that time face to require such formidable defenses in a city so confident in knowledge? Why such a commitment to stone and rampart? The question lingers like heat over the dunes. Walk, in your mind's eye, down one of MV's great avenues. Market stalls murmur in Persian and Sogdian, Turkic and Arabic. A scholar moves past with a bundle of manuscripts, treatises copied in careful script from sources as distant as India and as recent as last winter's disputation in a local madrasa. A caravan bell chimes. Somewhere a water wheel creaks. An astronomer steps out into the light to check a shadow's angle. This was MV's daily symphony, the kind of ordinary miracle that only a crossroads can compose. And yet, even amid such abundance, you can sense the city's precarious balance. All this brilliance riding on two fragile things, water and roots. That fragility was hidden by grandeur. The Mag River, MV's lifeline, fed irrigation networks that turned desert margins into fields, vineyards, and orchards. Aqueducts threaded the city like veins. The Silk Road pulsed with overland commerce, filling treasuries and libraries in equal measure. Political influence flowed from this dual abundance. Dynasties prized MV not only for its wealth, but for its leverage. To govern MV was to touch the nerves of Asia. But MV was never merely administrative. It was aspirational. Its libraries hosted rarities. Its schools welcomed strangers. Its artisans experimented with forms that blended Persian elegance with Seljuk rigor. Even its defenses, those towering walls and Gorala's broad shoulders, seemed to declare a city secure enough in its own purpose to protect what mattered most. Minds at work, prayers at dawn, trade by dusk. In many ways, MV was an argument made in brick and book that in the harshest places, civilization can still not only endure but excel. Which brings us to the mystery that will haunt the rest of our journey. How could such a place fall silent so quickly? The chronicles insist that in what felt like a blink, the jewel of Central Asia was erased, swallowed by time. Was the cause waiting all along in the fine print of MV's success? A metropolis yoked to a single river cannot afford a fickle current. A city whose wealth depends on caravans cannot ignore the rumor of a faster sea lane. A capital girded by formidable walls cannot pretend that walls are prophecy-proof. When a city draws the world to its gates, the world eventually arrives with more than trade. Before we face that reckoning, hold on to the questions MV itself would pose to you. Why did the world's greatest city vanish so suddenly, leaving behind crumbling walls and haunting mysteries? Was it the Mongol invasion, environmental collapse, or something even more elusive, a convergence that only looks simple from a distance? Share your thoughts below. The debate is part of the investigation. In the next chapter, we will move from the hush of MV's libraries to the roar of approaching hooves, then beyond battle to the slow, invisible forces of climate and commerce. Because to understand why MV fell, we have to look at how many ways a city can be mortal. Tragedy came to MV in 1221, like a dust storm drawing a line across the horizon and then swallowing everything in its path. After years of campaigns through Central Asia, the Mongol armies under Genghis Khan arrived at the city that scholars called the Mind of the Desert. MV surrendered. Surrender did not save it. Arab and Persian chroniclers, some horrified, some desperate to make sense of scale, wrote of a massacre without precedent. Hundreds of thousands dead, perhaps more than 1 million in a handful of days. We know medieval numbers swell in the retelling, but even the most skeptical concede the essential point. This was not mere conquest. It was erasure. Libraries burned. Mosques and Seljuk palaces crumpled into heat and rubble. The city that once measured the heavens could not, in the end, measure the fury that fell upon it. Step through the aftermath. The air is thick with ash. Scribes cradle singed folios, the last copies of disputations no one will argue again. Courtyards ringed with calligraphy tilt into ruin. Gorala, the immense fortress that seemed to promise safety, stands charred at the edges, proof that walls can be overwhelmed by will. Even if the chronicles exaggerate the death toll, the wound they describe is real, a trauma so deep that MV, once one of civilization's brightest centers, never regained its pulse. Other Silk Road pearls, Samarkand, Bukhara took their blows and rose again. MV staggered and did not. Was war alone enough to destroy a metropolis of this size? That is the question that keeps historians and archaeologists circling the site like careful detectives. The Mongol onslaught may have been the axe, but perhaps the tree was already split by unseen rot. One theory begins with the city's lifeblood. The Mergab River, a river in a desert, is not a promise. It is a negotiation. Over time, channels drift, silt clogs, floods carve new paths. If the river diminished or wandered, the irrigation lattice that fed MV's fields would wither. Orchards die first, then vineyards, then the stubborn cereals. A city of scholars can outthink many problems, but it cannot outthink thirst. Add the Karakum Desert to that arithmetic. Sand hungrily reclaims what water abandons. Canals choke, cisterns crack, wind drives, dunes along avenues once raucous with trade. Engineers can fight this. MV did for centuries, but only so long as the river cooperates. Without stable water, the foundations of urban life grain, animals, people begin to loosen. In that moment, even a glancing blow might be mortal. MV did not receive a glancing blow. Even if water had held, the currents of commerce were shifting. For generations, MV lived by overland caravans, camel-borne wealth that stitched China to the Mediterranean. But as maritime routes thickened and ships began shouldering more of the world's exchange, the Silk Road's golden thread frayed. Overland posts lost primacy, then traffic, then the taxes that kept walls repaired and teachers paid. A city that flourished because it sat astride the continent's arteries, discovered that history had rerouted the blood. Politics finished what climate and commerce started. After the Mongols, dynasties flickered and fought. In the new calculus of empire, MV was no longer the keystone it had been. Administrators favored other hubs. Treasuries flowed elsewhere. Without a patron, repairs lagged. Without repairs, people left. This is the quietest form of collapse. No single day to name, just roofs that go unrethatched and courts that go unswept until the only sound is wind. And yet there are signs that MV's story hides rooms we have not opened. Archaeologists speak of layered structures beneath the sands, of tunnels and substructures still largely unexcavated. Were they purely defensive ratlines, for siege and escape, ritual spaces, storage for grain and manuscripts when the world convulsed? If those subterranean veins are mapped, they may tell us whether MV's fall was a sudden failure or a patient retreat underground before the end. For now, they hold their silence. The comparison that troubles the mind remains. Why did MV vanish when piers rebuilt? Was it simply a matter of geography too deep into desert margins, too dependent on one river? Or did the city's very strengths become liabilities? A capital of learning and trade can be brittle when one blows out and the other flickers. A metropolis stitched by canals can be undone by a single meander of water. A fortress that signals security can make a conqueror intent on spectacle. It may be, as so often in history, that no one cause sufficed, but all causes, arriving together, made recovery impossible. After 21, MV lived on, but as an echo. For centuries, it lingered, hamlets clinging to ruined walls, markets shrinking to corners, prayers said in roofless mosques to a sky that did not answer. As the Silk Road grew quiet and the Murghab grew mean, the Karakum did its work. Sand-softened edges, buried thresholds, turned avenues back into dooms. By the 18th century, MV was almost a rumor, a name whispered by travelers who saw broken arcs in the distance and did not always bother to turn aside. Here lies the heart of our opening mystery, still beating faintly under dust. Not only the Mongol fury, but the question of why a city so brilliant disappeared so completely. Was this nature's verdict on overreach? A case study in how trade winds can strand even the mightiest, or the proof that some capitals are built on fragile terms, destined to last only as long as a river keeps faith and a route stays relevant? Tell us what you believe. Each hypothesis is a torch in the labyrinth. From MV's silence, we turn east to cliffs that refuse to be quiet. There, in the desert light of Dunhuang, caves bloom with color and line, an entire encyclopedia carved into stone. How did murals survive on rock that crumbles at a touch? Who sealed a chamber with 50,000 texts, then vanished into history? If MV is a lesson in how greatness can end, Mogao is a lesson in how it can endure. The path bends toward the caves of 1,000 Buddhas, east of MV, where the desert light turns cliffs the color of old parchment. 1,000 Buddhas gaze from the sandstone at Dunhuang. The Mogao caves, caves of 1,000 Buddhas, sit on the fringe of the Gobi, a place where caravans once shook dust from their robes and ideas from their minds. Here, merchants, monks, artists, and travelers carved chambers into soft rock that should have collapsed long ago. Yet more than 1,500 years later, the grottos still breathe color and line, a miracle of endurance that confounds archaeologists and humbles engineers. To grasp Mogao's scale, you have to translate numbers into breadth. More than 735 caves, roughly 2,000 statues, and over 45,000 square meters of murals, centuries of devotion layered stroke by stroke from the 4th to the 14th century. Each surface reads like a palimpsest of the Silk Road itself. Indian poses lean into Persian ornament. Central Asian textiles ripple through Chinese landscapes. Dunhuang was a crossroads where goods changed hands. Yes, but so did myths, mathematics, and metaphors. The walls became a museum of exchange, recording the roots of thought as clearly as the roots of trade. The enigma begins with the stone. Sandstone is soft, friable, a material that crumbles under wind and thermal shock. And yet these chambers hold. Ancient builders did not simply hack caves and hope. They engineered them. They cut into stable sections of cliff, shored voids with sophisticated wooden frameworks, and skinned walls with layered preparations. Straw-tempered clay to grip, then multiple thin coats of fine plaster to smooth and seal. Only then did brushes move. loaded with pigments ground from cinnabar, azurite, ochre minerals that lock light into crystal lattices. The painters did not work directly on rock. They worked on carefully staged grounds, where each coat was packed with time. That is why Mogao's blues still breathe, and its reds still glow, even when the wind howls outside. Even with such care, the cliffs should have failed more often than they did. That persistence has prompted bolder theories. Was Mogao's particular cliff band geologically favored denser, less fractured than the surrounding face? Did master builders pass down guild secrets, hereditary knowledge of timber joinery, and plaster recipes that our textbooks no longer carry? In some caves, the finish is so consistent across centuries that it feels like a signature that outlived the signers. We can name the minerals. The mystery lies in the ratios, the patience, the touch. And then there is Cave 17, the small chamber that burst the site into world history. In 1900, a monk named Wang Yuanlu broke through a sealed wall and found a hidden library. More than 50,000 manuscripts and paintings, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, histories and prayers written in Chinese, Tibetan, Sogdian, Sanskrit, even Hebrew. Who sealed them and why? One school sees panic, political and religious turmoil threatened knowledge, so guardians hid it. Another sees design, a ritual retirement of texts, a sanctum made to curate memory rather than hide it. Whatever the motive, the preservation is astonishing. In a desert so harsh, paper survived a millennium like a moth asleep in amber. The story turns complicated in the 20th century, when explorers and scholars carried troves of manuscripts and paintings out of Dunhuang to Britain, France, Russia, and Japan. Today, the archive of Mogao's mind is scattered across continents, while China preserves sublime but partial holdings. The dispersion raises questions larger than ownership. When a civilization's story is divided, interpretation becomes a relay race with the baton forever in transit. Will a reunited corpus ever tell the whole tale of how Buddhism, politics, and commerce intertwined here? Or will Mogao remain a puzzle whose pieces never sit on one table? Look again at the murals. They are not only visions of the pure land or mandalas of the cosmos. They are also portraits of courts, caravans, battles, harvests, a visual curriculum for a largely illiterate public. Mogao was pedagogy in pigment, moral lessons, cosmological maps, and royal narratives distilled into scenes anyone could read. Dynasties understood the power of that imagery. Patronage chiseled authority into the wall, and the wall taught obedience cloaked as compassion. Yet the art's syncretic ease, Buddha beside Bodhisattva, beside donor portrait, suggests something more open than propaganda, a confidence that ideas can sit together without dissolving. Dating the caves yields further surprises. Historical records say work began in the 4th century, but technical traces do not line up neatly. Some details look centuries ahead of their supposed era, perspective that anticipates later conventions, plaster treatments that seem improbably advanced. One explanation is continuity of craft, that guilds refined techniques for generations until entire sequences could be executed with effortless precision. Another is selection bias, that we see the best preserved outliers and misread them as norms. Either way, the impression remains unsettling. Time at Mogao does not march. It ripples. So how did a cliff of soft stone survive when empires did not? Some of the answer is chemical. Mineral pigments that resist fading. Plaster layers that buffer expansion and contraction. Some is architectural. Wood that flexes as the cliff breathes. Strategic siting in sections of the escarpment shielded from prevailing wind. And some is cultural. Communities that cared enough, century after century, to patch and repaint, to sweep sand and light lamps. If Mogao seems miraculous, it may be because we underestimate what relentless maintenance, guided by tradition, can do over 1,000 years. Still, the questions persist, like footsteps in a cave corridor. Did the ancients use binders or adhesives we have not fully characterized? Are there chambers not yet found beneath scree and drift? What was the exact calculus behind hiding the library? And what does its multilingual chatter say about how the Silk Road thought? Tell us your theory. Was Mogao's endurance a triumph of engineering, a lucky cliff, a spiritual ecosystem that made care a sacrament? or all three. Today, the site is a UNESCO World Heritage Treasure, guarded by conservators who measure humidity the way monks once measured devotion. The Buddhas look on, their eyes wide and calm, their colors soft as breath. We move on with them. From images that endure to a mountain that should have fallen but did not. Ahead, a haystack-shaped peak rises 150 meters into mist, its vertical face stitched with ladders of wood and corridors in the clouds. How did people more than 15 centuries ago carve caves, sculpt giants from clay, and bolt timber into sheer rock in an earthquake zone and make it last? Maijishan is waiting. Hidden among the mountains of Gansu, a sandstone peak rises like a gigantic haystack against the sky. The ancients named it Maijishan Haystack Mountain, and from a distance, it looks improbable enough. Come closer, and improbability turns to astonishment. The sheer cliff has been hollowed and laced with more than 190 caves, linked by a skein of wooden walkways that cling to the rock like ribbons in the wind. Inside those caves wait over 7,200 clay statues and sweeping fields of murals, 15 centuries of devotion pressed into earth, fiber, pigment, and nerve. Where Mogao lies like a library along a cliff, Maijishan rises like a city in the clouds. The story begins in the later Qin of the 4th century, and never really stops. Northern Wei, Western Wei, Northern Zhou, Sui, Tang, then on through Ming and Qing, each era carved, repaired, repainted, extended, and sometimes mourned. Maijishan sat on a side thread of the Silk Road, and you can read that road in the faces. Some figures gaze with the gentle compassion of Eastern Buddhism. Others carry the sharp cheekbones and drapery folds of Gandharan style. Still others wear a majesty and ornament that whisper of Persia. Standing in a doorway of wind and stone, you are inside a living museum of exchange, India, Central Asia, and China, meeting not in theory, but in clay. Yet, it is the engineering that steals your breath. Picture craftspeople on a near vertical cliff, carving chambers into friable sandstone, then weaving a web of corridors and bridges to stitch them together. From afar, the complex resembles a cloud-born labyrinth. Up close, it is nerves of wood and sinew of rock. Earthquakes roll through this region as regularly as seasons, and storms strafe the face. Still, century after century, most caves persist. Wooden galleries have fallen and been rebuilt, but the heart of the complex, those chambers and statues endure with an almost stubborn serenity. How? The answer begins with clay. Old at Maijishan, stone yields to sculpture, only to hand the stage to earth. Artisans kneaded local clays with straw, grass fibers, and sometimes hemp, turning fragile soil into a resilient, springy body, less prone to cracking. Over a rough core, they laid a skin of finer mixtures, ground stone powder as a smoothing coat, and then brushed on mineral pigments. Cinnabar for red, azurite for blue, ochre for the golds of halo and robe. The result is paradoxical lightness. Unlike monolithic stone colossi, these figures breathe. Joints flex a little with the seasons. The layered construction absorbs shocks that would have shattered a single block. The recipe feels simple when stated, but its ratios and timings, the way a master reads moisture in the clay, the exact moment to add fiber, the patience to cure and coat in sequence, are the kind of knowledge that hides in fingertips and apprenticeship, not in treatises. Clay explains the statues. It does not explain the mountain. To pin corridors to a sheer face in an earthquake zone demands an intuition for load paths and anchors that modern engineers recognize instantly. Builders bored into sounder rock, seated beams in sockets chiseled to hold against pullout, and distributed weight across multiple points so no single failure could cascade. Where the sandstone ran suspect, they thickened walls, shifted doorways, or carved buttressing ribs. The result is not brute force. It is negotiation with a living cliff. When tremors come, wood flexes, joints creak, dust filters down, and most of Maijishan breathes, then rests again. None of this answers the riddle of logistics. The colossal clay figures, some over 10 meters high, required tons of earth and timber. How did workers move such material up a vertical world? The prevailing theory imagines scaffolds tiered, like siege towers, and a choreography of pulleys, sledges, and human lines. Timber likely came from nearby forests, cut green for strength, seasoned on site, then locked into the mountain. Crowds of artisans and laborers, monks and patrons would have moved along those narrow ledges, carrying baskets, ropes, and cups of pigment, their footsteps tapping out the heartbeat of the project. Even with this picture, the scale remains audacious. You can't help but feel the old dizziness when you step onto a walkway and look down at terraces of air. Earthquakes have often been Maijishan's most implacable critics. Records tell of tremors that ripped away galleries like combing fingers through hair. Yet again and again, the core caves and clay beings endure, not by miracle alone, but by a choice of material and method. Clay's elasticity, wood's willingness to bend, and sandstone's layered strength formed a kind of alliance. Add to that an ethic of maintenance, repairs upon repairs across dynasties, and you begin to see how the impossible becomes routine. The question lurking beneath remains tantalizing. Did the builders possess techniques for anchoring and mixing that we have only half recovered? Or is Maijishan proof that persistence and refinement over centuries can equal the effect of a single lost secret? Walk the interiors, and the technical turns luminous. Fingers curl with impossible delicacy. Robe folds fall in cascades you can almost hear. Faces, some serene, some severe, hold expressions that feel freshly thought. Many still carry color, the mineral hues softened but obstinately present. In low light, blues breathe like dusk, and reds like banked coals. Outside, murals fold entire cosmologies into panels. Courts in procession, sutra scenes, battles and banquets, evidence that Maijishan was not only a sanctum but a school. Pilgrims learned here with their eyes and feet, moving from cave to cave, as if paging through a vast, illustrated sutra. Legends, of course, gathered. Stories of high monks so still that swallows built nests on their shoulders. Tales of statues whose gazes seemed to follow visitors. A trick of pigment and geometry that the heart reads as presence. Even skeptics concede a peculiar aura. On a narrow bridge with the wind rising off the valley, you feel small, provisional, and somehow steadied by the stubbornness of art clinging to a cliff. Maijishan. Today is a UNESCO-recognized treasure and a test of humility. Conservators map cracks, replace decayed timbers, and coax color back from the brink. They do so in dialogue with anonymous masters who solve the same problems with rope, rule of thumb, and an unerring feel for material. What did those builders know about anchoring beams into friable rock? How did they stage crews to keep dozens of hands safe and coordinated at such heights? Did they discover additives that hardened clay against rain and time beyond what we have reconstructed? Your theory belongs in the conversation. Share it. The mountain has more to say than any one voice can translate. From a city in the clouds, our path dips back to the grass sea of the steppe, where another set of mysteries lies under turf and stone. There, in monumental kurgans and quiet mounds, a confederation the Chinese chronicles feared, as the thunder of hooves left a different archive, horses by the dozen, weapons for an afterlife campaign, gold and silk that do not fit the caricature of barbarian. The Xiongnu tombs are waiting silent, elaborate, and ready to argue with history. Across the vast steppe of Mongolia and Inner Asia, the wind combs the grass and leaves small humps where the earth is not what it seems. Beneath those rises lie the tombs of the Xiongnu, the horse lords, whose name thundered along China's northern frontiers, whose raids bent dynasties to treaties, and whose silence today feels louder than any war drum. To their enemies, they were terrifying riders. To archaeology, they are a quieter revelation. Monumental burials that look nothing like a caricature of nomad, but everything like a power that could weave the steppe to the edges of the world. These are not mere mounds. The great tombs unfold as engineered complexes, square or rectangular precincts armored with stone revetments, chambers nested within chambers, and multiple subsidiary pits radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. In those pits, horses lie in ceremonial ranks, tack laid with care, weapons placed as if the afterlife were an endless campaign requiring speed, strength, and status. The gesture speaks a language older than borders. The bond between rider and mount was not pragmatism alone. It was identity carried into death. Step into one of these precincts, and you feel less like you are in a grave than a fortress of memory, built to hold a life in many dimensions at once. Open the coffers, and the steppe widens. Excavations from Noin Ula to other royal sites have yielded luxuries that refuse to stay in any one box. Exquisitely worked. Gold and silver sit beside bronze mirrors, fine ceramics, precious silks, and textiles whose techniques point unmistakably to hand workshops. There are ornaments and metalwork in bold animal style that echo Scythian or wider Central Asian traditions, stag and snow leopard, eagle and horse, stylized with a confidence that turns design into heraldry. The tomb is a conversation in objects, China answering Central Asia, Persia whispering to the steppe replying with its own grammar of power. The Xiongnu were not border brigands who snatched and ran. They sat in the middle of roots and relationships, controlling, negotiating, and profiting from a trade web that stretched farther than the eye could ride. Textiles are the most eloquent witnesses. In the cold, dry hush of elite burials, fragments survived embroideries, weaves, appliques bearing scenes of banquets and battles, clothing that maps workshop to region, and weapon details crisp enough to make an antiquarian giddy. They do not resolve into a single style. Some fragments are refined in ways that speak of Chinese looms and courtly taste. Others carry the taut energy of Central Asian animal motifs. Laid together, they read like an atlas of influence, suggesting a society that curated the best of what it touched and made something of its own, distinctive, mobile, and unembarrassed by mixture. Human remains complicate the story further. Skulls and skeletons, measured and compared, show diversity that resists easy labeling. East Asian traits in one burial, more Western Eurasian features in another, mixed ancestries that braid lineages the way a horse's mane takes many strands. This is not the neat profile of a single people marching through time, but the loose and powerful form of a confederation, tribes and clans allied under leaders who could make the steppe move in one direction when the hour demanded it. That fluidity might be the Xiongnu's real genius, unity without uniformity, an empire that rode on agreements as much as on hoofbeats. Here is where history and archaeology argue. Han chronicles cast the Xiongnu as barbarians, dangerous, undisciplined, a threat that required walls of rammed earth and seasons of campaign. Walk through their tombs, and that image crumbles. The funerary rites are complex. The craftsmanship is skilled. The grave goods are cosmopolitan. It is hard to call a people unrefined while holding a gold figurine the size of your thumb, whose lines find the horse's spirit in a few perfect curves, or a piece of embroidery that would not be out of place in a palace wardrobe. Propaganda has its uses in high politics. Archaeology has its uses in telling truth. Identity is not the only riddle under these mounds. The ritual language of the graves raises questions. No text answers outright. Why bury dozens of horses? Was it honor or obligation, sacrifice or provisioning? Some tombs show scorch marks, layers of ash, alignments scarred by burning. Fire might have been a purifier, a gate swung open with smoke, or a deliberate unmaking of worldly goods so they could be remade beyond. The steppe's religions are hard to reconstruct, but the pattern of horse, weapon, flame, and wealth suggests belief that the next world mirrored this one closely enough to require all the same instruments, status included. Every find deepens the mystery of origins and outcomes. Were the Xiongnu ancestors of later nomadic powers, the Huns who troubled Rome, the early Turks, the Mongols, or were they a powerful but passing coalition whose descendants dissolved into many names? The artifacts argue both ways. Continuities of style and practice ripple across centuries, while local differences insist on autonomy. Perhaps the better question is not who they became, but how their model of a flexible empire lingered. Like a template on the steppe one later peoples could pick up, reshape, and ride. Consider the scene at Noin Ula. Archaeologists brush away soil and lift a textile panel that shows a banquet figures reclining with cups, hair arranged in ways that hint at fashion codes we can only guess. Weapon fittings lie nearby, their gilded surfaces stippled with granules so fine you can lose them to breath. Somewhere else in the burial, a bronze mirror catches thin light and throws it back like a second sun. In a single tomb, three worlds meet: Chinese court, Central Asian workshop, Xiongnu camp. It is easy to see why the record's oversimplified. It is hard to govern a confederation, and harder to describe one without reducing it to fear. The search that animates the field today has the leanness of legend. The royal tombs of Modu Xiongnu, the great unifiers whose memorials some say could rival the grandeur of China's first emperor. None have been definitively found. Their absence is a presence, a hollow that pulls the mind forward. If such a site is ever uncovered, the contents may force a rewrite on origins, on the Confederation's inner working, on the ways the steppe linked far shores, long before the phrase Silk Road hardened into a map. Until then, we have the black boxes we can open, kurgans with their careful geometry, horse burials with their quiet pathos, goods that stitch a continent together in miniature. Each artifact tells and refuses, reveals and withholds. What do you think these tombs say about the Xiongnu's true identity? Were they one people behind many costumes, or many peoples behind one banner? Were they raiders first and traders second, or the other way around? Leave your reading in the comments. In the next chamber, a single figure gleams so brightly it becomes a national emblem. The Issyk Golden Man, dressed in more than 4,000 pieces of hammered light, wearing a headdress that points from earth to sky. Craft or mystery, borrowed knowledge or a lost tradition? We turn the lid and look. In 1969, deep in the Issyk Valley near today's Almaty, Kazakhstan, archaeologists opened a burial mound and found a vision forged of sunlight, a figure sheathed head to toe in gold. Not a trinket hoard, not a royal token, but a full regalia: tunic, belt, boots, fittings, scabbard, and a tall, tapering headdress that turned the silhouette into a prayer pointing from earth to sky. The press called it the Issyk Golden Man. Scholars quietly added another name, a revelation. Here was the Saka, the eastern branch of the Scythian world, speaking in gold, filigree, animal spirit, and astonishing technique, rewriting the comfortable myth that nomads could ride and raid but not craft. Start with a number that makes the mind stall. More than 4,000 separate gold elements stitched to cloth and leather like constellations tonight. Each piece is small, some only a few millimeters across, yet shaped with a precision that refuses to blur even under magnification. Animals leap from the fragments in miniature, deer with spiraled antlers and wind-sleek bodies, snow leopards poised over prey, eagles caught mid-swoop, horses compact with power. The motifs are not decoration alone. They are a grammar of the steppe, a theology of movement and mastery where the boundary between human and animal is porous and purposeful. Worn together, the pieces read like a map of power. The tall headdress, nearly 70 centimeters, functions as axis and emblem, a vertical myth that connects the rider's head to the sun. Technique is where awe turns into questions. The Saka goldsmiths hammered sheet so thin it flutters in breath, then drove detail from the back in repoussé before sharpening features from the front. They chased lines as fine as stitched thread. They soldered joins so clean that under microscopes they look grown rather than fused. On some pieces, they worked in granulation, pinhead beads of gold arrayed into motifs, set with such control that any excess heat would have collapsed them into anonymity. We can propose tools, clay furnaces fed hot and steady, blowpipes or bellows to push temperature past possible, mineral fluxes to coax metal to behave, but the confidence of the joins, the consistency of the finish across thousands of units, hints at something larger, not a miracle, but a mature tradition. Where did that tradition come from? One answer rides the roots we have been following: exchange. Crafts circulate like stories. A technique known on the Mediterranean rim can migrate in the kit of a single artisan or the memory of an apprentice who traded sea for steppe. The Saka sat in a crosswind of ideas. Perhaps granulation, solder recipes, and precision joining traveled with goods and were remade under a sky that favored horsemen. The other answer is independence, parallel genius. Give a people with metal in their hands and status on the line enough time, and you get breakthroughs that rhyme without copying. The Issyk regalia does not feel derivative. It feels conversant, a dialogue piece that speaks with Greece and Persia without being either. Identity complicates the shine. The skeleton in the tomb was too damaged for a simple sentence. Did this golden figure wrap a young prince, an elite warrior, a priestly person whose headdress served a ritual the text record can't quite name, or even a woman of high rank, an Amazon of the steppe whose status confounds modern assumptions? The regalia refuses to settle the matter. The headdress reads as royal, but roles in nomad societies can be fluid in ways sedentary chroniclers often missed. The safest conclusion is the most thrilling. Golden Man is a title more symbolic than diagnostic, a stand-in for an elite whose gendered markers may not align with ours. Inside the burial, another voice survived in metal. A silver bowl incised with signs many believe capture a Saka language. It has not been fully read. If the script yields. If someone learns to listen to those scratches the way we learn to hear Linear B or Mayan glyphs, then the Issyk burial could speak in a different register, telling us not only who wore the gold, but what was said over the body before the soil closed. For now, the bowl holds its counsel, an alphabet of silence that keeps scholars respectful and restless. National stories grow where artifacts catch light. In Kazakhstan, the Golden Man has stepped off the mound and onto plazas, postage, and pride. An emblem of a past that does not need to borrow anyone's glory. That public symbolism sits beside the scholarly puzzle in a productive tension. The more we see the Issyk regalia, the more we ask the right questions. How were so many minute elements fabricated to shared standards? Did workshops specialize one for animal plaques, one for edging and eyelets, or did single masters move between forms as the commission demanded? What binders held granules in place for heating? What fluxes coaxed the perfect wedding of joins? Can experimental archaeology, with period-appropriate tools, truly replicate the shine and sharpness without hidden modern assists? The Issyk burial also folds back into the larger Silk Road picture. Those animals, that headdress, those joins together, they demonstrate that the steppe was not a blank between real civilizations. It was an engine of synthesis. A testing ground where techniques that elsewhere lived in separate circles met and made something audacious. When we put this regalia beside the Xiongnu's mixed grave goods, Mogao's polyglot library, and Maijishan's hybrid faces, a pattern emerges. The middle of the map was not empty. It was the workshop. So we put the regalia on, in imagination, and stand in the chill of a dawn more than 2,000 years gone. Gold catches the first light. Horses snort steam. The headdress draws a bright line between ground and sun. Whatever the funeral words were, they promised continuity that the world beyond required the same alertness, speed, and grace as this one. Perhaps that is the lasting message buried in the Issyk mound. Craft as memory, technique as identity, metalwork as an argument that the steppe did not merely pass through history. It made it. What do you think? Forged the Saka's extraordinary gold work borrowed knowledge, perfected in motion, or a lost lineage of workshops whose recipes dissolved with their patrons, and who truly wore the gold on that last day? A warrior prince, a priestly guide, a woman whose rank rebukes our modern guesses. Leave your take. Ahead, sandstone becomes scripture as we walk into the ravines of Dazu, where Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism share a single stage, and tens of thousands of figures hold their color against time. If Issyk is gold made into language, Dazu is stone turned into speech. In the hills of Chongqing, the ravines turn into galleries, and sandstone becomes scripture. This is Dazu, a complex of more than 50,000 carved figures and close to 100,000 inscriptions, chiseled between the 9th and 13th centuries into living rock that should have weathered away, yet somehow has not. If Mogao is a library and Maijishan a cliffside city, Dazu is a stone sermon, a place where philosophy, politics, and devotion step out of books and take on faces you cannot forget. What startles first is the coexistence. Elsewhere, monuments pick a single creed and magnify it. Here, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism share a stage without flinching, Shakyamuni sits calm beside Guanyin, whose 1,000 hands fan out like a halo of intentions. Nearby, Taoist immortals stride with philosopher's ease. And a little farther on, Confucian paragons teach by pose and parable. The visual grammar does not collapse from the weight of so many languages it harmonizes. Medieval China at Dazu is not a battlefield of ideas, but a negotiated peace, a public agreement that the world is large enough to need many maps. Yet sandstone is a fickle partner. Soft, easily scored. It should surrender to rain and wind. Warum hält es? Part of the answer lies in craft. Artisans chose stable cliff faces, carved with an eye to drainage and overhang, then finished with plasters and mineral pigments that locked into the rock's pores. Reds from cinnabar, blues from azurite, yellow ochre's colors that, when sheltered and renewed, can outlast dynasties. Stand before a niche. And the surprise is not only in the precision of features, lips just parted, lids half closed, the weight of a robe caught mid-sway but in the color still clinging to folds and halos like breath on a cold day. Scale does the rest. The 31-meter reclining Buddha stretches along a cliff, its immobility paradoxically alive, a giant in meditation so quiet the air seems tuned to the same note. The 1,000-armed, 1,000-eyed Guanyin is a feat of both devotion and geometry. Hands layered upon hands, palms turned outward, each with an eye, each carved to an individuality that betrays countless hours of attention. There is a moment, standing under that constellation of palms, when you feel not watched in the modern sense but witnessed, as if the stone has memorized the presence of every pilgrim who has passed. Dazu's carvings are more than visions. They are curriculum. Relief sequences present the 24 paragons of filial piety, like panels in a graphic novel, acts of care, sacrifice, and duty, played out in stone for an audience that might never read a sutra or a classic. Elsewhere, the 18 levels of hell twist moral law into visceral warning. Tortures enumerated with a formal clarity that collapses the space between art and instruction. Rulers and clergy understood. Images teach quickly, but the carvings exceed propaganda because they never settle for simple moral arithmetic. Look longer, and the scenes complicate merciful details, soften harsh judgments, spectral humor sneaks into severity, and everyday life jostles beside cosmic order. A woman scolds a child to pay his respects. A demon pauses, almost bored, before his next task. A bodhisattva looks less like a distant ideal than a neighbor with infinite patience. And then there is the aura that refuses tidy explanation. Some faces seem to register light from angles that do not exist. Some eyes follow with a depth that feels like more than a trick of curve and pigment. Visitors report a hush that is not merely the quiet of ravines but a density of attention, as if the site itself were a listener. Skeptics call it suggestion. Believers call it presence. Either way, Dazu is one of those places where the categories we prefer, art, religion, engineering, stop holding neatly and you feel the human urge that made them all at once. Technical puzzles sharpen the wonder. How did carvers maintain consistency across so many panels and centuries? On rock that peels in heat and weeps in rain? Did they use grids and proportional cannons now lost? Mathematical schemas for laying out arms and halos that kept rhythm across generations? Why do some arrangements feel centuries ahead in spatial planning? Or some polychromes hold with a tenacity that makes modern conservators jealous? One school argues for a quiet science of stone, empirical knowledge of orientation, runoff, and microclimate layered into every decision. Another hears whispers of guild secrets, binders, undercoats, varnishes that never reached parchment. The truth may be less mysterious and more profound, relentless maintenance by communities convinced that care is a form of worship. Still, the site holds mysteries that exceed technique. Certain compositions seem to encode more than narrative. A geometry that points to cosmology. A sequence that reads like an initiation rather than a lesson. The filial piety panels, when walked in order, function as a choreography that pulls the viewer from domestic obligation to cosmic compassion, a political theology hiding in plain sight. Elsewhere, esoteric iconography hints at knowledge reserved for initiated eyes. Are we seeing a public catechism alone, or also a whisper course in metaphysics? Scholars split. The stone keeps its counsel. Modernity adds its own chapter. Conservation is now a discipline of humidity sensors and laser scans, yet the essential task remains medieval. Keep water off the faces. Keep color in the folds. Keep the pathways safe, so more feet can learn what words alone cannot teach. It is not just preservation of art. It is preservation of a way of teaching a society what it is and wants to be. Stand at dusk and watch shadows pool in niches, while the last color holds to the last light. And you will understand why Dazu feels inexhaustible. Every return is a different reading. Are these images only the product of gifted hands and patient care? Or do they carry a message that refuses to be fully translated, a metaphysical signal carved into rock in the hope that it might outlast noise? Tell us what you see. When you look into the eyes of the thousand-handed one, in the next stretch of desert, we will trade stone for mud brick and color for dust. Stepping into the ruins of Subashi near Kucha, the monastery city that birthed a master translator, flourished as a crucible of Silk Road culture and vanished almost completely. If Dazu is about endurance, Subashi is about disappearance, so thorough it feels like a magic trick performed by climate, war, and trade winds. We go there now. On the outskirts of modern Kuka, where the Tarim Basin's wind scours the earth into ribbons, the ruins of Subashi rise like broken teeth of sun-baked mud brick. Once, this was no mere monastery tucked into a desert bend. It was a scholarly, religious, and commercial engine at the Silk Road's throat. A place where caravans paused, monks debated, translators honed language into a blade, and the air itself seemed busy with exchange. Today, walls slump back toward sand, lintels lean at odd angles, and the light falls through what used to be roofs. The silence tempts a mistake, to think little ever lived here. The truth is, the opposite Subashi lived so fiercely that its disappearance feels like a deliberate magic trick. When archaeologists pried at the site in the late 19th century, scale-corrected assumptions. They mapped foundations of grand stupas and broad shrines, dormitories where monastic life would have ticked in ritual time, and courtyards that once framed statues and sutra recitations. All of it built of materials that modern prejudice deems temporary mud brick and timber, and yet much of it survived in outline across more than a millennium of punishment. You look at a surviving pier, its core hard as fired clay, and wonder what recipe, what rhythm of kneading and drying and layering, coaxed such durability from dirt. In a basin that breeds entropy, Subashi briefly imposed order. The art fragments tell the rest of the story, in color and line. Buddha heads with the serene weight of India, robes that fall with Chinese grace, decorative details that trail the curving elegance of Persian motifs. Each shard a witness that Subashi stood at a crossroads and refused to choose a single direction. The Silk Road was not an abstract idea here. It was the daily traffic of pigments and aesthetics, metaphors and methods, braided into a house style that belonged to Subashi alone. Look closely, and you can feel the hands that painted sutra scenes, the fingers that smoothed clay over armatures to give a bodhisattva's gesture the softness of breath. Threaded through these ruins is a name that echoes far. Kumarajiva. Born in Kuka and sharpened by its schools, he became one of the greatest translators of Buddhist scripture into Chinese. His renderings of key texts so lucid, they redirected an entire civilization's thought. Subashi was his cradle, his proving ground, the place where language and doctrine met in the mind of a genius. To walk here is to walk through a vanished university, a campus without buildings, where the curriculum once included Sanskrit, Kharosthi, Chinese, debate, and meditation. When we say Subashi mattered, we mean it changed what Buddhism meant to hundreds of millions across centuries. And yet the record shows a cruel arc. From the 3rd to the 8th century, Subashi rose stone by clay, student by teacher, into a radiant center. Within a few centuries more, it faded to almost nothing. By the 9th century, the religious pulse had stuttered out. The usual suspects appear: climate, war, trade, each persuasive on its own, devastating in combination. Start with water. The Tarim Basin is a ledger, and the only currency that matters is flow. For a time, rivers fed by the Tian Shan snows made habitation not just possible but radiant. Irrigation for fields, channels for orchards, wells that kept cells and kitchens cool. Then the climate shifted. Drought lengthened, channels silted, springs grew mean, grassland browned into scrub. Scrub wandered toward sand. In a desert, once your hydrology fails, your theology follows. A monastery can survive lean years. It cannot survive thirst. When water left, people followed. Add the human weather, conflict. The Kuka region, lovely and strategic, sat exactly where empires rubbed raw Chinese dynasties, pressing west, northern nomads pushing south, kingdoms of the western regions playing both sides. War is not only swords against walls. It is caravans that no longer trust the road, grain that never reaches markets, patrons who move their purses elsewhere, and artisans who find safer valleys. In Subashi's surviving brick, you can see the scars of fire, the abrupt collapses where force exceeded design. It is not hard to imagine banners on the horizon and monks deciding, quietly, that devotion required relocation. Then trade, the most invisible of gods. The Silk Road was a braided river, always shifting strands. In the 8th and 9th centuries, storms of politics and the rise of maritime routes tugged the braids south and elsewhere. Posts that had prospered by catching the overland flow found themselves marooned. A center like Subashi, thick with scholars and sutras, still needed coin for plaster and grain, for copyists oil and sculptors pigment. When merchants stopped arriving in numbers, the economy that subsidized piety thinned to a trace. A monastery without maintenance becomes a metaphor, beautiful and then broken. Scholars propose the composite answer because the site demands it. Climate, war, and trade erosion did not take turns. They piled on. The result is not just decline, but a vanishing act so thorough it unsettles. Other monasteries in the region, Kizil, Bezeklik, also suffered, yet they left longer tales of activity, more stubborn echoes. Why did Subashi go so quiet, so fast? Was it more exposed to wind and drift? Were its waterworks more brittle? Did political protection evaporate more completely? The comparison sharpens the outline of the mystery rather than filling it in. Stand in the heat where a hall once hummed with chanting. The light is hard. The wind tastes of salt and dust. You can trace the footprint of a stupa with your shoes and know nothing of the relic once inside. It is in such moments that Subashi's questions press hardest. How did builders reinforce mud brick against a climate that eats edges? What precise mix of silt and straw achieved that iron hardness in cores? What was the daily life of repair? The humble heroics of sweeping sand, from thresholds, patching plaster after a squall, rehanging a door after a shift in its jamb. The site's endurance, brief as it was, suggests a culture of care that matched its culture of thought. Artifacts still whisper of the world that fed that care. A robe fragment whose dye sits between Indian red and Chinese vermilion. A fragment of molding where a Persian vine curls into a Chinese cloud. The remains of a cell where a novice may have traced a Sanskrit syllable on the floor before copying it to a page. Each survivor is a fragment of a map, with most of its legend missing. Modern science, geological surveys, paleoclimate cores, new digs promises pieces, not the whole. That may be fitting. Subashi's lesson might be precisely the fragility of brilliance in a marginal land. How much genius depends on a river that keeps faith and a road that keeps promise. Why did Subashi vanish, while neighbors limped on? Tell us your read. Was it the cruel arithmetic of hydrology, the blunt force of campaign, the slow strangulation of trade, or a hidden flaw in its sighting that made collapse all but inevitable? Share your theory below. Because from Subashi's dust, we are ready for one last turn in the labyrinth. A return to where we began. The pattern behind rise and ruin, endurance and erasure. In our finale, we will gather these strands: Merv's silence, Mogao's color, Maijishan's stubborn grace, Xiongnu tomb's Confederate truth, Issyk's golden grammar, Dazu's stone pedagogy, and Subashi's disappearance, and ask what they tell us about the fragile magnificence of human civilization. History is not a straight line. It is a labyrinth. We began with that truth, and then walked its winding halls through MV's vanished avenues, into Mogao's painted light, across Maijishan's sky-born corridors, beneath the turf of Xiongnu tombs, past Issyk's hammered sunrise of gold, along Dazu's stone sermons, and finally through Subashi's dust-blown arches. We asked what truly raises a city, what preserves a shrine, what buries a people's name, and why some colors breathe across millennia while entire capitals fall silent in a season. Now, at the labyrinth's center, the echoes converge. First echo. Brilliance loves the borderlands. MV flourished because it sat between empires, at the keystone of routes that braided China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean. Mogao and Maijishan turned cliffs into sanctuaries because the Silk Road did not just ferry goods. It ferried techniques, pigments, stories, and patrons. The Xiongnu, so easily dismissed in hostile chronicles, built an art of empire from variety Han silk beside Scythian goldwork, mixed ancestries under one banner. Issyk's regalia spoke the steppe's grammar in micro-sculpted gold. Dazu blended three philosophies into a single classroom of stone. Subashi wove Indian doctrine, Persian ornament, and Chinese language into a monastic engine that helped Kumarajiva translate Buddhism for a continent. In the middle of the map, the empty spaces turn out to be workshops where civilizations meet and change shape. Second echo. Every masterpiece has a maintenance plan. Mogao's miracle is not only pigments and plaster. It is centuries of hands sweeping sand, patching cracks, renewing faces. Maijishan survives earthquakes because wood flexes, clay breathes, and 1,000 small repairs answered every tremor. Dazu's figures stand because communities learned the rhythms of water and shade. Even Issyk's perfection suggests workshops that trained eyes and fingers to the same quiet standard. When we talk about ancient secrets, we sometimes mean something simpler and harder. Devotion written as routine, craft disguised as care. Third echo. Fragility hides in success. MV's wealth rode two delicate rails, water and roots. When the Merv River shifted and sea lanes thickened, the greatest city in Central Asia became mortal. Subashi's glory depended on hydrology, on caravans, on patrons with steady coin. When droughts lengthened and wars clipped the roads, excellence could not pay for its own upkeep. Even the Xiongnu's strength, confederation contains risk. Unity that depends on charismatic centers can dissolve into many names. Greatness is not only built, it must be continually renegotiated with rivers, winds, trade winds, and wills. Fourth echo. Propaganda is loud. Archaeology is patient. Chronicles painted the Xiongnu as barbarous. Their tombs answer with cosmopolitan grace. Later, collectors pried Cave 17, opened and scattered its knowledge across continents. Today's conservators try to braid that library's story back together, page by page. The records of conquest in 1221 roar. The silt lines of the Merv whisper. To read the past honestly, we learn to hold both registers at once, the trumpet and the dust. What, then? Do these 7 sites, our 7 turns in the maze, tell us about the old question? Why wonders endure or vanish? They teach that endurance is a design choice, multiplied by time. Choose flexible materials and modular systems, and your sanctuary breathes with the cliff. Align imagery with moral pedagogy, and your carvings recruit entire communities as caretakers. Share technique along the routes of commerce, and your goldwork becomes a language many understand. But they also teach that no choice immunizes a wonder against the world. Rivers meander. Trade shifts. Armies arrive with reasons. Sometimes, the grain of the land itself decides. They also hand us a final paradox. The very mysteries that frustrate us are what keep these places alive in our imagination. If we could name the exact binder in Mogao's plaster, the precise fiber ratios in Maijishan's clay, the solder flux in Issyk's joins, the cryptic motives behind Cave 17's ceiling, Subashi's sudden hush, or the Xiongnu's royal graves, would the wonder dim? Perhaps a little, but answers do something better. They sharpen new questions. Solve one ratio and you start to hear the workshop. Read one inscription, and you start to hear the person who cut it. The labyrinth does not end. It opens. So we circle back to you, our fellow traveler in this maze. We asked along the way, what truly caused Envy's fall, Mongol fury, climate drift, or a perfect storm? How did builders coax soft sandstone into 1,500 years of color? What anchored timber into a living cliff? Were the Xiongnu one people, or a confederation tuned like an instrument? Did the Saka perfect borrowed techniques, or invent their own gold grammar in motion? Do Dazu's images merely instruct, or do they encode a cosmology we are still learning to read? Why did Subashi fade more completely than its neighbors? Your readings and theories are not a footnote to this journey. They are the journey's continuation. The past is a conversation, not a verdict. Here is our closing thesis. Carried out of the labyrinth like a lamp, civilization's greatest feats are not monologues of genius but choruses of contact. Trade, speaking to craft. Craft, speaking to faith. Faith, speaking to governance. All of it balanced on mundane miracles like water, timber, clay, and the willingness to show up tomorrow with a broom and a brush. We revere walls and statues because they look permanent. We should also revere the invisible labor that kept them from falling yesterday. They will stand one last time at the edge of each site, in your mind. The wind of the Karakum moves over Envy's lines in the sand. A monk at Mogao trims a wick and checks a crack. A carpenter at Maijishan sets a new beam into an old socket and hears the mountain accept it. A Xiongnu artisan pins a final granule and thinks of a horse at full gallop. A Saka master polishes an edge until it catches dawn. A carver at Dazu steps back and sees 1,000 palms blur into one compassion. A novice at Subashi fills a jar from a thinning channel and whispers a line of scripture that will outlive the roof above him. In those moments, the labyrinth is not a trap. It is a house we build together, room by room, question by question. Now, it is your turn at the door. What thread will you pull? Which answer will you defend? Which mystery will you keep alive by refusing to let it end at an easy sentence? Tell us below. The past is listening.